Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our channel. So I'm continuing with our discussion of the book Beyond Bilal, and this is really the final uh uh set of discussion that we'll have on this book. I'm going to transition to another book, but all throughout this month of February, I really wanted to highlight the scholarship, really relatively recent scholarship that has been done on Islam in the Black experience. So, this last chapter he has before Malcolm X. I don't know if this is the last chapter I'm going to read. Before Malcolm X, Black Muslims in the Americas. There's a lot here, and it's too much to go through. I don't want to take up too much time, but just sort of giving us a sample of the idea for us to really know that this history, is very important. One of the things that I mentioned in the previous video is that according to the estimates, 20 to 40% of the Africans enslaved and brought to the Americas um, were Muslim, and that we came from and we were influenced by. Even those who weren't Muslim, they came from areas that were still influenced by Islamic culture, Islamic life, so on and so forth. So one of the great scholars in the history of African Americans, he actually is the one who coined the term Black Muslims in America. Dr. C. Eric Lincoln, who has since passed, relatively recently, he passed away. He had a theory that the resurgence of interest in Islam and the surge of African Americans coming into the religion of Islam, that perhaps this was something in the genetic memory. A lot of people have visited, a lot of Blacks have visited the door of no return. And they report that when they go there, they just feel something overwhelms them or something overcomes them that they can't quite explain. There are other people who tell the story that when they were just growing up through their life, they were searching for something. And it wasn't until they heard Islam that they felt at home. They just knew in their soul, they just knew in their heart, this is it. So there's a mysterious element to it. And then there's also a scientific element to it. We know that from a genetic aspect, the history of a people are preserved, it stays with them. But we also know from a spiritual aspect, like in the spiritual sciences of Islam, a people's history remains with them. And he highlights in this particular section of the book, there's a lot of theory here, not from him, I'm saying in this area. Like I mentioned, the sisters Sylvia and Diouf, even in her book, she theorizes that perhaps persons like Frederick Douglass are even uh perhaps descendants of Muslims. And there's reasons for that. She's looking at the name Bailey, Belali, etc. So he goes over just some general points of history, but then he also recounts some very, I guess I would say, notable figures that have come out as of yet. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, Omar ibn Said. We have a masjid now named Masjid Omar ibn Said in his honor. Yaro Mamaut, who is a very popular figure, who was they covered him recently on a PBS special. Abdul-Rahmaan ibn Ibrahima Sori Bari. So these are individuals who became known. Bilali Muhammad, Yunus Bath. They were enslaved and they gained some notoriety for themselves. They became persons who were known. Um, then what he does after this, and he doesn't just cover strictly the America. He talks about the Americas, people who were brought here, period. Then he goes into what we call, or what is called, I think Dr. C. Eric Lincoln also coined this term. These are considered in the field of scholarship proto-Islamic movements, meaning that they were movements pointing to Islam, but they preceded the coming of quote unquote Orthodox Islam. And the first that he cites is the Moorish Science Temple, whose founder, Noble Drew Ali, he goes through his history. And the Moorish Science Temple was very influential in the United States of America in the early 1900s. Then what he doesn't cite here, but I would add, is the Marcus Garvey's movement, UNIA. Marcus Garvey's mentor was a Muslim, and Marcus Garvey is on record, though he was Christian, he was on record highlighting or lifting up the Muslim man as the ideal type of man that our people should aspire to be like. And then he highlights the Ahmadiyya movement. Again, I think that there's a PBS special out now. It came out relatively recently regarding the presence of the Ahmadiyya in places like Detroit and Chicago, here in Washington D.C. They were present in Black America during this same time. So these movements were the first movements exposing Black people to Islam. Now, the Ahmadiyya wouldn't consider themselves to be a proto-Islamic movement. They would consider themselves to be an Islamic movement. But to be fair, there are two strands. There's the one strand that says that that leader, that founder, was a prophet after Prophet Muhammad. And that's rejected by the mainstream or the main position in Islam. Is rejected in the Quran. They give Allah says that of our prophet, he is Khatamun Nabiyyin. He is the seal of the prophets. They give some type of interpretation of the term seal, saying that in fact prophethood is not closed, and that's rejected. And they face a lot of troubles in parts of the world. But there's another group of Ahmadiyyas who say that he didn't claim that, and they don't accept him as that. And that other group, they one of their most influential scholars was Maulana Muhammad Ali. And Maulana Muhammad Ali, his book, for example, The Religion of Islam, if you buy a copy today, there's the sort of letter of approval by the Department of Publications from Al Azhar, saying that this publication is legitimate and it has beneficial knowledge in it for people who speak the English language. And he also did a translation of the Quran. And he also wrote several other books like Gog and Magog, etc. And what's interesting is his books are the primary books used for Islamic studies in the Nation of Islam. So this author goes from the Ahmadiyya movement to the Nation of Islam, which began in 1930. And then there's a long history there. All of us know of the Nation of Islam, or many of us do. And if we don't know the nation, we do know notable figures such as Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Minister Louis Farrakhan. These are the persons that come out of the nation under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad. And then he concludes that section with the what essentially becomes the leadership of Imam W.D. Muhammad, the one who was elected to be the leader of the Nation of Islam after the passing of his father. And his being elected as the leader, that was pointed to, that was like actually a part of the nation's teaching, that when Farad Muhammad came, he was to continue a work. Elijah Muhammad, no, he was to start the work, pardon me. Elijah Muhammad was to continue it. And he told him, at that time, his wife, Sister Clara, was pregnant. And he told her that you have a son, you're pregnant with a son, and that child is going to help in this work. So name that son after me. So the name W.D. Muhammad comes from the name W.D. Farad, which is the name that, he told them that was his. And that's a long history in and of itself. And then, of course, he goes over some other movements. He talks about the Islamic Mission of America. He talks about the African American Islamic Institute, which is really something that comes out of West Africa, and it's like an institute set up here to connect African American Muslims to Islam in general, but also to Islam. This is mainly out of Senegal. This is Sheikh Hassan Cisse, who also, I think he passed the same year Imam Muhammad passed. And the big sheikh, for them, they're Tijani, but the big chief is Sheikh Ibrahim Inyas, who passed away in 1975, if I'm not mistaken, the same year that Elijah Muhammad passed away. And there's a history there. And he was known as really a giant of spirituality and scholarship in his own right, respected globally. But with all of this history, the big point that I'm really highlighting here is that there seems to be, or that what we can see from the beginning. So if we go back to how we even started with this book, and that's why I think that this is a good book worthy of getting. We should have a link down in the description if my link people can put it up there for me. From the time of the beginning, we have persons from the African continent around the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him. And Islam stays active on the African continent. And that activity on the African continent continues from the east across the north, down into the west coast of the African continent. Great civilizations are established, scholarship, industry, the sciences, etc. All of this is brought about. All of this is advanced on the continent in the spirit of al-Islam. The North Atlantic slave trade comes along, and it takes some of those populations to the New World, 20 to 40%, as we mentioned. And some of these New World people, they didn't forget Islam. Some of that history I didn't recount, like in Brazil, like in Haiti. There are historical records of African Muslims enslaved, but keeping their freedom spirit and fighting for their freedom and achieving it eventually. What we have happen in the Americas is that we have certain notable figures who were slaves, some of whom were scholars, some of whom were princes and noble persons. They gained notoriety in their time, and a lot of literature has been published about them lately. But then we fast forward and we see these proto-Islamic movements, which are really seen as an awakening of the Islamic conscience in our people. So if the slavery experience sort of put our Islamic conscience to sleep, these proto-Islamic movements are efforts. They're dawning, they're awakening that, hey, we're Muslim. We belong to the Muslim people. We belong to a greater civilization, a greater history. And this extends our sense of self. And this movement has really been continuing from the early 1900s into the late 1900s, all the way till today. So a part of our work right here, even for this channel, the community that I represent and the other African American communities that I interact with, we are aware of, or we should be aware of, if we're not, that we are a people. We should see ourselves as a people of destiny, as a people that have been called back by Allah into al-Islam, which is our birthright, al-Islam, which is our natural inheritance. The world of slavery, the world of white supremacy took us away from that. And it robbed us not only of our religion, but our sense of self completely. Our ability to manage our family, our ability to think for ourselves, our ability to produce for ourselves, so on and so forth. And now our our return into Islam, it is a part of a broader effort to establish ourselves in civilization again. So we will not be satisfied then until we have the same degree of achievement that our foreparents had on the continent of Africa, either equal or better to that. In other words, we want a Songhai, a Ghana, a Mali, a Songhai, a Sokoto Caliphate. We want that established. Our work is to establish that here in the United States of America, equal or better for this time, by the sons and daughters of Africa who have returned to al-Islam. So inshallah, when we in the next series or the next book we'll pick up, we'll look some more at this issue of Islam in the African American, or diaspora experience. Until then, peace. Assalamu alaikum.